I will call this meeting to order for the Committee of the Whole meeting on Monday, March the 19th at 6 o'clock. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the shared traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. With that, can I have an approval of the agenda? So moved. We have a mover. Any discussion? Second. Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. We have two sets of minutes to adopt, one from February the 27th and the other from March 5th. Could I have a motion to adopt? Councillor Day?
Thank you. I'll move adoption, but I do have just a small amendment. Sorry, no, I just lost my place. I had it. On page 4 of the February 27th minutes, fourth paragraph down, it says Councillor Day indicated, and it should just say Councillor Day asked with regard to the rock face monitoring, if the city is responsible for those rock faces, etc. And there's one other, I just had a question to staff in regards to the minutes and the rock face monitoring, which it does explain that ongoing monitoring of the rock falls will be done if the city is responsible for those rock faces. But I'd just like some clarification on our responsibility. So, for example, if we've approved a rock wall and it's adjacent to a public roadway, it could potentially put the public roadway at risk. Is that something that we are considering we're responsible for?
Mr. Howitt?
Mr. Chair, the reference in the minutes was relating to rock walls or cut faces in rock side cuts. They're in public right-of-ways for road, where a road was punched through. For instance, there'd be a rock cut. We are responsible for doing the inspections and scaling if there is any loose rock or anything like that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And I think there was a change in the other minutes. I just got to double check. There's just a very small grammatical error that I'll pass to staff on the next set.
Okay. Can I have a motion to move the or adopt the Committee of the Whole minutes for February 27th as amended?
So moved.
Okay. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Second set of minutes. Councillor Day just has a few typos to
Sorry,
pass on this time.
my motion was for both sets of minutes, and it's just a really tiny one, so it's just a period. That's all.
Okay. Great. Okay. Before we move on to public participation, I just wanted to point out item 4.1 on the agenda is there more for information purposes for committee, and after public participation we will jump right into the presentation from Mr. Holland. Okay. No further ado, I'll open up public participation, and I will ask if you do wish to speak, then to come up to the mic and state your name very clearly as we're recording this meeting. Come on, don't all be shy.
I'll wear my environmentally sensitive shirt this evening. Batteries are not required for this one. First, I'd like to start off by recognizing the efforts of city staff in encouraging public input on the OCP. I think in addition to sticky dots on maps and yellow stickies on boards, I want to thank an unknown public works person at the branch drop-off on one Saturday who directed me to go to the beach because somebody from city staff was collecting comments about the OCP at some sort of a display on the beach, which I eventually did get down to. I think that's just a small example of the commitment that city staff have put in towards making sure that anyone who is interested in commenting on the OCP or providing some input to it was definitely afforded the opportunity and was made to feel very welcomed in doing that. Now, my second point is actually my favorite part of the OCP, and of course everyone has a favorite part in the OCP, I'm sure. On page 100, you can read Objective 13.2.3, and this is to support and reinforce cultural inclusivity and involvement. In light of some recent events and funding decisions that were made by Council, I want to point out that there is now policy 13.2.3.1 in this draft OCP, and that begins with the phrase, ensure cultural resources and activities are inclusive. And that's something that's very important to me. So I'm very happy to see that that's in the plan. On a more technical note, on page 74 in section 9 on housing, the overview states, in July 2017, the average cost of a single detached house in Colwood was over $660,000. Now, according to the Victoria Real Estate Board, that number was based on the sale price of 13 houses that sold in the single month of July 2017. I think a statistically more robust statement would be based on publicly available information from BC Assessment. Specifically, the average assessed value of single-family residential properties in Colwood on July 1st, 2017 was $571,000. I think this difference in values is significant enough to warrant changing what is presented in this section of the OCP. And then finally, I'd like to welcome Mr. Holland, who's visiting us from Nanaimo, and apparently he's a spokesperson for developers, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else before we dive into the presentation? Michael.
I was just thinking back over input we've had in the past, and
So Michael Baxter,
oh yes, Michael Baxter, 3338.
of all the people, you
H
should
Inc.
know the drill.
Yes, I should. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was looking back over the input we've had, thinking about what was just said, and I'm really interested to hear what the developers say, and to hear the back and forth, perhaps, or what the council says following what they hear from the developers. I think it's a really interesting issue, and I just hope it doesn't get overshadowed by whether their input is too late or not, as really the issue is, what is the right answer? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else before we dive into the presentation tonight? Seeing none, Mr. Holland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got hard copies. We weren't able to get, your system can't plug into a laptop, so it would need to have been all scanned for viruses, and that was not able to happen during business hours. Paper is a renewable resource. That's a lot of paper. Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members, council, staff. Thank you very much for making time for us in this process. I realize the OCP consultation process unfolded in a certain pattern, and there was some concern that this group came to the table late. On the first pages here, most of the slides, folks, are just words here because I wasn't sure if folks would need to read it or not. I'd like to just frame the presentation and make a few comments on the importance of the OCP, get into the challenging issues. It's 250 pages, as I think you all have read it through. My notes were 38 pages of detailed bullet points, and I've tried to pull that back to 6 or 7 kind of clusters of opinions. I'm going to take you into some nitty-gritty detail and then come back out of it. So that's kind of what we're doing. I'll just kind of summarize it and close. I'm not exactly sure how long this will take. I'll go as fast as I can with respect to the evening. First, I need to position myself in this process. I know that I've been branded as the representative of a bunch of developers. It's not entirely true. In the agreement, I'm pretty much an independent person who comes into this. I was a city planner. I've served as a development executive. I'm now a professor of planning. And most of tonight, what you're going to hear from me is kind of professorial. I don't actually have elbow pads on this thing, but I kind of felt like I needed to. And so in some cases, there's been a lot of good work done in this document. And tonight, because of the timeline, I'm going to spend too much of my time on the things that I think need to be addressed or changed. So I apologize if the tone comes across as negative in some of the work. That's not so much what I'm intending. I have so much You won't believe me probably, but I have so much respect for those of you who act as counselors. Anyone who's known me over the 25 years I've been in this business will have heard me say so many times, I'm so glad someone wants to do that job, because it's a thankless job and it's a very difficult job. It politicizes your life and you're thrown into all kinds of things. So some of what I'm going to talk about tonight actually is the political ramifications of what I'm seeing here. And I got quite concerned over the last 3 weeks as I worked my way through this, going, I think there's a bunch of new due diligence that needs to be done in the process, because I think you've been asked to potentially adopt a bylaw that has a lot of unintended consequences. So the tone, I would hope you take it in that spirit, that it's not intended to be whining or complaining or criticizing. It's intended to be a constructive, collaborative conversation. I have no business interests in Colwood. I have no contracts with any of the people who pooled together a small amount of money to pay for my time. I have no contracts or interests or intent to have any business interests in the future. I'm completely autonomous in this process, and they've affirmed that to you. So that's what, and I'm taking on a huge reputational risk today. Everyone wants pause to speak, and today I have some, and some others speak, so we'll go for it. The frame, moving on to page sort of 4 and 5, the frame for today's discussions. Really, the core thing that I'm going to talk about is the ideas that came up in the consultation and that were in the old OCP versus some of the realities we're struggling with. I struggle with this as a venue. This is not the venue I would normally want to have this conversation in. There was sort of a certain sense of when I discovered, because I interviewed dozens of people in this, there was sort of a sense that the door was closed. The OCP committee has, I gather, now been formally closed according to the terms of reference at first reading. It ended, so this is the basis on which we need to have the discussion. I want a collaborative working relationship. I think everybody does. And the nature of development for those of those people that I talk to, they just want to get on with building things. So the collaboration is really ideally where they want to be. The draft of the OCP, as you know, I think I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of how many of you have read all 250 plus pages of it. I'm only going to cover some of the depth of comments that I went into today. I've organized them into a few key categories, and I'm going to focus a bit on the technical and the political implications that I see. So moving on then, just a basic premise on the importance of an OCP. An OCP, as you know, sets the next 10-year plan. It's 5 to 10, but typically your last one was 10. 10 is the norm. And as per the last OCP, this will now carry forward for the next 10 as well. There's a lot of that content going on. So this is a looking forward document that leans forward 2 decades. You have climate commitments and other things in here that reach out 1 more decade. So this document is going to carry you fundamentally halfway to 2050. So looking ahead is a very, very key issue here. It sets targets. It positions you in the regional role. It gives you some of the most powerful legal leverage you can get as an OCP. You can turn down applications for no other reason than it's not in the OCP or it's contrary to the OCP. So it's a very powerful document. It determines, and we'll come back to this a couple times, it determines the land that is available for people to move into Colwood. It sets community expectations, as you've heard from many of the great people who participated. The list in your OCP of the number of participation moments or interaction moments is huge. Each of them gave you their comments, and with that, they yielded to you their expectations. And so this document is very, very important for that relationship you have with everybody. And of course, then when folks don't necessarily agree with it or come in outside of it, it politicizes that discussion. It's done in a high overarching kind of goal and vision level. And because there's development permit guidelines into it, it drops into a very detailed level. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that issue. My biggest concern here is that you've been presented with an omnibus bill. There's an enormous amount of detail and issues in here that are coming through in one binder. And one of the 7 things that I want to talk with you about is the need to pull some of that out because it's tripping over other bylaws, and that's going to create some legal exposure for you. So it's this kind of, OCPs are half art, half science. Moving on then, the past OCP, the province mandates that an OCP is changed, that it's updated, and that basically presumes as you move forward, not that what was there was good, but what was there needs to be grappled with. So that becomes a whole discussion in here. Anything that's in the existing OCP needs to be grappled with because we're not looking back, we're looking forward. And I think the conversation of the next 10 or 15 years, we're going to see a lot of interesting changes. So that's really the frame for an OCP. So I'm going to look at substantive issues. Some of these are professional standards, technical issues, facts, implications, real hard choices. And some of them are sort of the more political, moral positioning or exposure you get from these implications that move forward. This is particularly true. I don't think anybody likes doing big OCPs in election years, because election years politicize everything. You can't breathe without it being politicized. And when you take a document forward that touches every aspect of your community, it gets to be really, really squirrely sometimes. So that's where I started getting quite concerned. I started doing the technical review, and then I found myself circling back for half a day and went, ooh, I need to warn you, I need to caution you, just offer some caution. So these are respectful cautions. Next page is then onto page 10 and 11. My primary 7 concerns that I have here. I believe you're halfway through the planning process for your OCP, and if you proceed to try and adopt this now without the due diligence, which I'll talk about first and when I get through these, in the implications of some of these, then I think it's going to bring many problems that were unintended. I think the consultation standards for the first part of it have been exemplary. They've been absolutely fantastic. But if you proceed now to adopt it, there's a whole pile of consultation on implications that didn't occur, so I'll talk about that. The structure of the OCP overall is fine. You've got your vision, you've got your goals and policies, you work your way into the design guidelines. I found myself confused after many days of finding policies in guidelines and guidelines in policies, and they were kind of mixed up, and so there's kind of a cleaning up to do, and I'll talk about why that's important. I believe your site adaptive planning process, while I understand the desire to protect the beauty and ecosystem in Colwood, I think it's going to backfire on you. And so I want to offer an alternative. I want to dig into some of my concerns about that because I believe there's some very real risks to you in this process. So the structure of growth is the next one. You have targets for growth. You have climate targets. And the interesting dynamic you're going to run into is when your climate targets and your other targets begin to run into each other, you're going to find yourself having conflicts and crash together unnecessarily. Some of the design guidelines are very personal to the designers and consultants, and I think they add unnecessary costs. And that's where we kind of go down a rabbit hole, and I don't want to take you down into the rabbit hole of precise meterage. I'll just mention a few of them between here and there. And finally, the lasting concern, the lasting encouragement I want to leave with you is to work on the relationship with the women and the men who build homes in your city, because there was a sense of tension and frustration, which is really unfortunate, because I see council and staff as one side of a coin, and the people who then build the community as the other side of the coin, because we don't build anything, somebody else builds it, but we work with the community to choreograph the vision for it, and the two have to be constantly in contact with each other, and when they get broken apart, everybody loses. Ultimately, the community is the one that loses. So we'll pile into the first of those a little more detail. I'm going to play professor here for a moment. I'm going to show you some slides from my first week or two of lectures I give planning students, and some of the early sort of definitions. Planning, in my experience, is basically making order out of chaos. You have a pile of things, people's needs, urges, market forces, regulations, multiple layers of government, and it's the planning process that helps coordinate the people and the information to bring them together through options and ideas to be able to get some action on that meets their goals. So that's the whole premise of planning. It goes both general and detailed, and I think that there was not enough detail on this draft. And so if you adopt this draft now without the additional work on the implications of the details, I'm concerned that it's going to be incomplete and going to have some challenges. The next page is just a reference point. This is the formal definition of planning from the Canadian Institute of Planners. I just highlighted the 3 top words on it. If you want to become a planner, then we dig in all to this stuff, but there's a lot of discipline in planning. Planning is very different than consultation. Consultation is one small piece of planning, and it runs into many different points in the process, but the structure of planning is scientific, it's orderly, it's got standards, and it's very rigorous. So your next slide on 13 there this is a slide I show my students, I think, on the second day of classes. If you asked your director of planning to, okay, Mr. Borhill, please put together the 15 steps of planning, his won't be quite like that, but it would look a lot like that. And if you want to Google up the steps of planning after this, you'll find them very, very similar to this. My proposal to you after reading through this is you're about halfway through. You did a lot of planning, you did the process together, you did some research, you created some of the frameworks, you created a process plan, you got the community together in numerous locations. Some of the terms of engagement were set, certainly per the OCP committee. You created visions, you created goals and objectives, and they commented on the existing ones. Where I ran into trouble was I didn't find the metrics, targets, the criteria for assessment, the options for that in how things were worded. There will certainly have been some that went on quietly on the side, but when they've been done deeply, you just find it all in the writing. You can't not write about it when it's in there. Then the plan that actually comes out of that, you as council know that the community has heard the hard choices. They've heard the hard discussion, and when they give you that advice, you feel confident about moving forward based on that advice. My concern is we're only about halfway through here because I didn't find, and I talked to a lot of people who were involved in it, that kind of level. If you go to the next slide on 14, this is a separate version. It's a subset of planning practice called policy analysis. Many of you are familiar with this. And again, I've underlined a few things that I didn't find. So it's a very similar, slightly different. I didn't see a lot of issue frameworks. I'll get into some of that in a little more detail as we go. The policy community was very general. Your OCP committee model was quite unique. I've never seen anything quite like that as a way to gather the complexity of issues and stakeholders. The metrics, the options, the evaluations, again, stuff you do in public policy. I'm sure some of it was there. I couldn't find a lot of it here, and what was missing was deeper than that. And so that was why I come back, is to say there's nothing wrong with this. It's just got a lot of unintended consequences if we don't finish off the process of doing some serious rigor on this. So everyone is going to debate with me on that process. This is my professional opinion based on my experience. A couple of new words for you. We started an irreverent glossary of planning terms at VIU these days based on our own having to build a curriculum around critiquing, most of us are all full-time practitioners, what we're doing. These are two. One is Instagram planning, which is essentially you take a picture of someone's sketches, or you take a picture of a great place, and then you say, I want one of those. What you need to understand is that every picture is the product of a community, a politics, an economy, a location, a jurisdiction, a regulation structure. And they often can't be replicated. It's very difficult to replicate them. But when that becomes really kind of the fundamental reference point for idea generation, is fine, but it doesn't, you have to do the due diligence on it. And the second one is Post-it note planning, which is where we amass a lot of Post-it notes and ideas and notes from meetings, and they basically get translated straight into policy. And this is where my point is that consultation, which is generally this kind of activity, and real planning are actually quite different. And consultation is a sub-piece of it, but there's a whole pile of diligent analysis that has to go into testing this stuff. So two terms for your next barbecue on the porch. The work that's required to transform those ideas into a real plan is the next slide. So what we find often is you can disappear down a rabbit hole of doing technical analysis, and often it's not you spend a lot of money on it, you may or may not get a good example or good outcomes. What really matters is this kind of solid stop, and you look at it and go, what do we really mean by those words? We think we know what they mean. So that's why I gave you the next column there. The words protect the environment. If I say protect the environment, I mean, I was Mr. Sustainability forever. I deeply believe in protecting the environment, but when I get into it as a professional planner, I find it's almost meaningless as a phrase, because we have to define what we mean by protect, and we have to define what we mean by the environment. And when you put those two in a matrix, you get everything from I want the earth to be healthy and ecosystems not to be under stress, all the way down to you cannot touch it, or like a green building, you can tear the entire thing out to a giant hole in the ground and we're going to put something special up that comes back and adds a whole new ecosystem and everything else. All of those would qualify as protect the environment. And then when you add it to the complexity of a city, it gets to be very, very complicated. And so that specificity, you're going to hear me talk a bit about that, is that I think that there's some due diligence, and it's with the stakeholders that this emerges, because they're the people who go, what does that actually mean to me? And that's when you get that fabulous interchange of mutual education. Well, we know the community wants this. Okay, but that's going to hammer me here. What if we tried this? And that's the creative dynamic of turning ideas and pictures and desires into a good substantive plan. So my concern, problems is maybe a bit of a big term, but if this is adopted as is, I think some of the challenges you're going to face is that those frameworks weren't unpacked enough to be able to give you clear metrics, defensible. We're really clear about what that means. There's quite a few options to achieve these goals. Some of them were evident in that, many of them were not. And I just think that the implications to some of the stakeholders needed more conversation, and that in the end is going to be my recommendation to you, that there's just some more detail that has to be done. This is a fantastic first half of the work. There's more work to do. I've called it due diligence on the next slide. What this really means is asking the outcomes. Is it feasible? You're going to see me run a few quick calculations in here in the next couple of sections, and sitting down with people who really know what they're talking about and saying, how we can actually do that? What does that really, really mean? It goes beyond public consultation. At this point, you're into that professional due diligence stuff. So my concern to finish off this first of the 7 pieces is I'm concerned that a bunch of the ideas in your OCP are going to, and the dreams that the community has entrusted you with, are going to run aground in the process, because that extra bit of specificity, due diligence, and how are we actually going to do this hasn't also been commensurate with all of the interesting ideas that were gathered together. My concern for you all as politicians and decision makers is that that sets you out on a bit of a limb on this case, is because you're endorsing a vision, you're endorsing goals, and yet the hard questions and trade-offs have not been had. That conversation hasn't been had yet. So you're hoping that it's solid. You're hoping that all of that has been done. My concern is that I didn't see that it had been done. Some of it will have been done, and I wasn't able to find it in the process. But this is just me trying to look out for you on that one. So if we move on then to the second point of discussion, which was consultation. If we approve this now, then we haven't had the consultation on all those hard choices. We've had them on the ideas and the great comments and wishes, but we haven't gotten down into the hard choices, and I'm going to very shortly come to some of those ones. I look at this as quantity when I'm putting together or I'm teaching students as quantity versus quality. It's maybe a bit of a rough term, but lots of consultation is great. It's always good. More minds, the better. The question is, what were the questions we were asking? Were we asking them of the people who were going to have to pay the price or do the work? That's the quality question, because there's a moral and ethical dimension to it, but as a policy analyst, the point is to give you as the decision maker that confidence that this is really, really strong. So this comes down to trade-offs, to hard discussions. Do you want to achieve your climate targets, which means you have to do some very significant densification along corridors, or not? If that conversation doesn't happen, then we think we can have them both, or we think we can have one of them without the other, and that's not the good hard trade-off you need to have. You need to be educated on how the community feels about some of those. Your planning OCP committee discussion here, I noticed, I just had a bit of a chance to look through the original report from the consultants, which looked pretty normal and conventional and good. The way the OCP committee was structured, I don't understand it. I'll just raise it as an issue because maybe it was something that I didn't understand, but to have a quorum of 4 for a committee meeting is kind of interesting on that one. I'm not sure where that came from, because if that's going to be the basis on which all of this feedback has to come, you need different ways of going about it to talk to different people. So I'm just going to raise that as an issue of what I found. I'm not going to draw any big conclusions from that, just to say that. Now, when I say some of the standards, your next slide on 21, so because planning and consultation are different, they overlap with each other. Consultation fits within planning. Planning is bigger than that. The IAP2 group, the International Association for Public Participation, is considered the professional reference for public participation methods. This was the best, most crisp version I could get out of off the websites, just to kind of paste that in, and there's the website address if you want to go take a look at it. When I looked through all the different things they did, your OCP process to date had a lot of contact points. It got a lot of great ideas. I talked to people who were in those meetings, and they said, like, we talked for 2 or 3 hours about something, people took notes, and then it went away. And then the draft arrived, and so that was the process. If you read through this, and I won't take you into it in detail, you can read through it, they use words like analyze, evaluate, alternatives. There's those kinds of words, and that's what you're going to hear me talk about. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, and I don't see that reflected in the consultation notes. I read the big stack of them. I think there's more work to be done. This is great what's been done. It's just not finished yet. So that's my concern with this for you, is that are there other ways to do it? So if we move on, then there are principles in consultation that are respectful, that show continuity of past commitments. Any of you, I require my students to read The Trusted Advisor as a textbook, and it's relentless discussion about the importance of transparent conversation and commitment and following through on commitments. When we have agreements between the community, between the city, between landowners, those need to be respected. There's an enormous amount of mutual education that has to occur in these projects. You have to educate the community. You have to educate the stakeholders, like any of those who are involved in this project, and then they in turn educate you. And that's that mutual building process. It's not an oppositional one. There's detailed, there's appropriate methods of talking to people. So if you're going to talk to seniors, you're not going to use the same techniques when you're going to talk to young families. If you're going to talk to young families, you're not going to use the same techniques you're going to use to talk to business people. So the consultation method has to be many-faceted to actually not only meet them where they are, otherwise you get a very poor showing. You don't actually hear from them. You don't get a chance to educate them and them educate you. And so you need a very diverse dynamic of this. Then it has to go to expert analysis so that you're having real conversations about the hard things. You need extra time for those who are impacted, and the real discussions on the hard choices. The next slide is an unfortunate one. This was This left me very disappointed. I'm going to single out Councillor Knoll because he was put in charge of this. But the women and men who build the community are actually the ones this OCP is targeted to. I didn't take the time to go through every page of these 250 plus pages and say, on a probability of 80% of this page is targeted at those. But I'll wager it's probably about 80% of this document is actually not for the community. It's for those who build the community. It's written with and by the community, but actually when you say the road should be this, you should protect trees here, you should do this, the only people that's targeted at are folks who actually build buildings and build landscapes and build businesses. And so to have had the group that is actually pretty much the primary intended client group for this singled out negatively has created, it's part of, in my conversations, I was deeply dismayed and disappointed in what I saw as a very
Mr. Chairman,
big...
I'd like to comment on that. I believe I'm being unfairly singled out. The development community had a year and a half to participate in this process. The majority of them chose not to. That's nothing of my doing. That's their doing. So now we're having an open public meeting to hear your concerns. That's council's doing. I also want to strongly object to your wording on slide 4, where it says, I and the stakeholders were publicly forbidden by Councillor Nault to work with the staff directly at the last council meeting. That was a council decision. That was not my decision. I pointed out that everybody else, all of the other meetings were open public sessions. I have no problem with meeting with you in an open public session, but that was not my decision. That was council's decision, and it was unanimous.
So acknowledged. Which
Okay, so we've got some
presents a very
clarification.
interesting question. Carry on, sir.
Yeah, we've got some clarification. I would just ask you to continue and.
No, that's fine. This is a tough one.
Yeah.
And at the end of this session, I'm going to come back because this, as an outsider with no interest, past, present, or future in Colwood, but one I've worked with so many councils and teams on both sides of the table, that good working relationship is key. And when that begins to break down, just like a marriage, everything begins to fall apart. When you can't communicate, you don't trust each other, it all begins to fall apart. And I heard so much of that in my interviews. I had to raise it. I sweated this one. What do I say here? Because it's not something nice to talk about. In fact, the home builders were involved. I talked to them. Many of them were involved in many of them. The counterpoint to that observation is, had 30 home builders attended every one of your OCP committee meetings, you all have been taken to the mat by the community for being in the pockets of the developers who are writing your OCP. There's a dynamic here that has to occur in how you work with them. Plus, an open OCP committee to just talk about the ideas people have about something isn't the kind of thing that a concrete person who's covered in drywall mud and been nailing hammers and doing stuff all day long, it's not typically a way you go and meet with them. So in my comment about seniors and children and students, this key interest group, they're not a lawn bowling club. They're fundamentally going to be the only people who implement this, and you need to go and meet with them and talk with them. So that's going to be my final recommendation is the end, is that a much more open-minded shirt sleeves process, line by line, we need to go through this process. So what I'm conveying to you here is partly my opinion from what I heard, and it's you need to understand this is very, very strongly felt by the community, to the point that some of the companies who build homes here wrote up analysis of your documents, of your OCP, and then decided not to submit it because they were very concerned about the negative reaction or the negative relationship that would create here. And many of them are here, barely here. They're waiting to see whether they're going to get hung in this process. I heard it again and again and again, and I have no interest in it. This is not, I'm passing this on to say there's a problem in the relationship and we need to get on with that, to fix that, because you guys are tied at the hip for the rest of your lives here. This is how it's going to be. So anyway, and there were major submissions. Not only were the OCP committee meetings were only one piece of this. Once the draft arrived, some of the largest submissions that I found in the package of community implication came from the home builders. There were some there was 10, 20, 30-page documents, line by line, I read. To staff's credit, a bunch of those were addressed, many of them were not. So there's this kind of question of, well, how are we having, the thing is that paper back and forth on these complex issues is very difficult. If I'm talking about grades on a road and what the standard is for setbacks on certain things, it's kind of hard to have that when a bullet point exchange in a piece of paper. You kind of need to sit down and go, what are we trying to do here, and work that out. And that's my point here, is that the consultation process needs to address this in a slightly different way. So on the next page is then the last one, just to finish this difficult topic. I think your public actually don't, I'm concerned that they don't fully understand the hard questions and the hard decisions that are going to come up over this, and that public consultation needed to be had based on the input you would get from this detailed process of like, well, do you understand what that's going to do? Is everyone okay? It may be fine. If everyone's okay with a $5,000 increase per door because of some standard that's come in, if everyone's okay with that, then everyone's okay with it, so long as we understand that that's the implication. 250 pages is pretty difficult. I'm not sure how many people in the public will have read this document. Yeah, and so from your position, this puts you as council in a difficult position of wondering, you know, do people really understand the implications of what you're about to approve, and do you have the feedback sufficient on that one? So to keep moving then to the next one, just watching time, this is really more of a technical discussion on the structure of a policy document or a planning document. There's professional norms, and your OCP generally follows them quite well. Overarching visions and intent and value statements, policies, goals, objectives, and then you get down into the detailed guidelines. I found a few times throughout the whole thing that they got a little bit mixed up. It's understandable. It just takes another rigorous read-through. For instance, in the policy chapters, there was talk about exact dimensions of sidewalks. It may sound like a small thing, but it starts to make the thing confusing. You want to talk about the intent and directions you would have around sidewalks, that 0.8 meters or 2.1 meters. It needs to go into a design guideline. In fact, I'm going to argue it shouldn't even be in an OCP. That's you actually already have engineering bylaws and guidelines that cover that one. The one I found that I just had to pull out to you was deep in the design guidelines. We're talking chapter 25, between a couple of bullet points that talked about the height of a fence and the distance between the road and a sidewalk and a few things like that, was a bullet point that said address the needs of teens. And I sort of paused for a moment and said, I don't know what that means. So back to protect the environment, if we unpacked that, what does the word address means? Teens between young women, young men between 13 and 19 need very different things. So there was kind of a disciplined read-through that needs to happen to pull some of these out, because what happens in the design guidelines is you're down in the building permit level. You're way into DP and DP variances when you're working with those, and suddenly we have a free-for-all on teens, and everyone's kind of, I don't know what that means. And you want this document to be taken really seriously, and when that shows up, they're like, well, that's pretty, I don't know, what does that mean? At worst, they ignore, at best they ignore it. At worst, it becomes a debate between people about what that should be, and that's really unhelpful. So it's not everywhere. By and large, I found that, you know, probably 85–90% of it is fairly crisp, but it doesn't take very many of those to get it confused. There's a lot of sections that are going to keep your community and everyone from reading it because they're repetitive, huge sections. So I would encourage the next read-through on this is to pull a lot of the repetitive sections, like there's SEPTED sections that are in almost every one, pull them out as standalones, and then you'll get this down to a much shorter and smaller in ability to do it. Some of the language is lacking specificity. For instance, in your DP application list, there's now a municipal economic evaluation of development requirement. I asked a lot of folks, I said, that's interesting, I've never seen that. What does that mean? No one knew what it meant. There's no guidelines or standards. You may have that in another document or somewhere else. What I read that to be is an asset management perspective on the roads, pipes, pumps, and wires that are associated with the buildings. There's no way any developer or builder can ever know that. That's a huge, complex discussion. If you've ever done asset management reviews for your own community, you'll understand how complex that is. So that was, and that's in the DP, that's a DP submission requirement. It may be optional in some cases, but other ones, wasn't quite sure what these mean. So there's a specificity here that creates confusion that just needs another good run through. The best way to do that is to sit down with the people who use this on a daily basis and talk through it, and they'll go, you know, actually, I'm not quite sure what that means. Well, what are we trying to get at there? Okay, why don't we rephrase it this way? Now everybody's clear about it. One of my bigger concerns for your sakes is the next ones on page 28 is the regulatory overlap. Your OCP goes romping right through the middle of your zoning bylaw. It sets FARs, it sets setbacks, it sets heights, it sets a lot of the fundamental things that are part of a zoning bylaw. And so this becomes a bit of a challenge. I'll talk about, so and it contradicts your zoning bylaw in a few places. You have duplexes in your OCP with 4-meter setbacks in the design guidelines, and in your zoning, from what I could find in quite a few of the zones, there's 3 meters. So this sets up a legal confusion for you when someone's trying to do a yield study or figure this out. once you get into that much detail in the zoning, in the OCP, you're now in the middle of a zoning bylaw. Now, OCPs talk about land use, they talk about general form of development, the design guidelines get into it, but when you get down to actually naming numbers, setting those standards, you're into the zoning bylaw. Your site adaptive planning is where I'm going to go next to talk about this, but I have a great concern that through the site adaptive planning and the tree bylaw combination, that all of the areas that are listed as environmentally sensitive or steep hillsides have now been effectively rezoned. Your zoning establishes the area of a site that you're allowed to use, your site coverage and things like that. When you now add tree vegetation and root balls to it, and that, you suddenly now change the ability to actually do this, because now we're in a fight over how we are going to take out what trees, what actually land can we use. And it changes the densities. I'll talk with you about that. Your site adaptive planning is taking you in the opposite direction to your climate change things, because it's reducing density, not increasing density in key areas. You have a lot of sign controls in here. Those should go in your sign bylaw. You have a lot of SEPTED and safety regulations, which also trip up over your zoning bylaw. So that's a whole piece of regulatory alignment that I think you would be wise, because otherwise you're going to find yourselves in debates over this, and that's unnecessary. So my concern is that the lack of specificity and some of the confusion is just unnecessary. It's going to cause everybody some heartache and challenges, and it's not something you as counselors, that's not what you're here to do, is to arbitrate those kinds of things, to deal with downzoning, huge swaths of people's land and then have to deal with the angry legal responses from that. So I think that can be cleaned up. Let's just the due diligence checks in the next 2 pages. We don't need to go into those. That was just basically a few points. You can read through them at your own time. Moving on to page 32 and then beyond. Let's just go on to page 33 for time, onto the site adaptive planning. I'm going to be blunt about this. This took me back 25 years to the courses in forest ecology I took when doing my landscape architecture degree. We had some environmentalists come into the class, and I had a ponytail and earrings, and I was an environmentalist. I wore tatty clothes, and I tree planted for 7 years. I was definitely out there living in tents. But I was also studying science, because that was my degree. And we had some environmentalists come in, and they showed pictures of clear cuts. And it was very interesting, because by then we had come to really understand a whole lot more about the forest ecosystem. And this was a class that 70% of us failed the midterm. It was really, really heavy science going. And what we discovered from that discussion, a couple of things. One is urban forests are very different than regular forests. And in a regular forest here on the coast, actually the biodiversity levels are not actually that high. And when you get a clear cut, within a couple of years in the ecotones that develop around that, you not only get a super high carbon sequestration process from all these rapidly growing plants, you get an enormous amount of diversity which supports a whole lot of birds, mammals, and many other different types of insects and animals that you would never find in a mature forest here on the coast. Now, you're in the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone, which is different than the coastal hemlock, which you'll run into if you keep further out towards Souk. This is more biodiverse and more urban friendly, except that many of the native species aren't so good. So arbutus, Gary oaks really struggle in urban environments. Arbutus hate their roots being hammered by construction and things like that. So there's this kind of dynamic of what occurs there. And my concern with this is that it's a bit retro. It seems to have missed the last 20 years of urban ecosystem work we've all been doing to both achieve higher densities to achieve our sustainability goals and build really thick, rich urban ecosystems. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that as we move on. My concern is that site adaptive planning reduces the whole complex urban ecology to basically trees when they're only one type of vegetation in a much larger structure, which I'll get to in a moment. So it's very important to separate aesthetics from ecology. Both are absolutely imperative, and if you remember back to the discussion on the definition of planning, scientific and aesthetics were next to each other. So they're both critical, but in policy, they're different. You're working one with views from public streets, which is, if you're going to save trees, like when you go up the Malahat, all uphill from you is clear cuts, except there's a 50-meter buffer or a 30-meter buffer there. You don't even see them most of the time, but it's actually huge amounts of that hillside is clear cut. You get the aesthetics of a coastal Douglas fir zone, but actually it's this huge working forest around you. So I think it's important to kind of change those, because if we just focus on preservation of existing trees as our fundamental keystone, we're going to miss a whole lot of other opportunities. The second thing is that in the principles of urban forestry that have been developed extensively in the last several decades, few things have been learned. One thing is trees keep growing. Second thing is their root balls, their roots are the most important part of a tree for its longevity, and in urban settings, they're getting hammered. People are driving their RVs over them. They're cutting off the roots to keep them from getting into the drains. They're cutting them down to put in the new driveway, they're building plants all over them. Sometimes they're watering them, sometimes they're not. And into that tree just keeps growing. And then when you add the pressures of climate change, of increased droughts and then increased storms, suddenly it's not a static, like in a natural forest, letting the trees grow. They blow over, they become a nurse log. It's fantastic. They open up all the trees around it, and they become a nurse log for a whole bunch of species. In an urban setting, when that tree comes down, it's a whole different matter. You've got houses, people, kids, liability, risk, et cetera. So that combined with some of the native species don't work so well. I think a more nuanced approach to achieve what I understand your goal, which is to, I'll use the word protect the environment, but to enhance the environmental richness, the complexity. You want a lot of trees in Colwood. It's part of what's beautiful about the West Coast, and part of, you still have areas that are treed. You want to keep that quality and not simply knock it all down. The thing is that pretty much everywhere it goes, when communities started, they knocked it all down. I think that I have a picture there of, so if you back on 35, that's Oak Bay Avenue, circa 1900. I went into the archives just so I wonder what that looked like. So if you go into Oak Bay now, of course, it's 100-year-old trees and Gary Oaks everywhere, but that's actually what it looked like. So even most of Colwood was clear-cut before it was built, and then the trees come back. We're really blessed at the coast. The stuff I'm doing in the Okanagan, it's a desert. Things don't grow back. Here we do. On to page 36 and 37 then. 36, the challenge with SAP, Site Adaptive Planning, and another version that was added in this draft, which was conservation subdivisions, is there are actually techniques used on the edge of where communities meet rural areas. So it's basically a rural methodology primarily. So in conservation subdivision, they actually do things very different than Site Adaptive Planning. In conservation subdivision, you take 10 acres, that you would normally put 5 units per acre on 50 homes, and you mow the whole thing down. What Randall Laurent did in that plan was he said, take that 50 homes, bring them into small lots at the front, everything goes. So you clear cut the front bit, you put the homes in there into a village, and then you conserve the rest of it. So there's a very distinct recognition that when development goes in, the trees typically come down. Conservation subdivisions say, we'll protect those. That doesn't talk really about the design of the site after that. Urban ecosystem management planning says, let's get into the site plan, which is where I'll take you next here on this process. Why this matters is you have density absorption goals for many, many years. You have climate change goals, which are really key. And the current, right now, fresh off the press, in Olympic View, where site adaptive planning is being fully implemented, you're achieving 1.3 units per acre on a sewer line next to a town center. So you are achieving massive tree preservation. The challenge is that it's working against your asset management, it's working against your transit service, it's working against your walkability, it's working against mixed use, it's working against diversity of housing. So it's a direct trade-off because it has to do with plan, view, look. It's that tree or a building in these areas. And so that gives you a really good reference point for site adaptive planning now in full play and what that's actually going to do. My problem with, as I'll get to in a moment, is what the implications are of that. There is an argument that SAP is only theoretically applied to hillsides and sensitive areas. Unfortunately, however, it is referenced in nearly every chapter of the OCP in some formal or informal way, and as such, in the negotiation debates, it's going to have much wider application than you might think. My other concern with it is that it's not a professional standard. There's no definitions, metrics, practices, organization, discipline, research, standards of practices, or education for professionals on how to do it. So it becomes a little bit ad hoc in its application, and your staff are very smart and educated people, but they can't be qualified professionals in planning and engineering and also be registered biologists, hydrologists, soil scientists, dendrologists, et cetera, arborists to look at this. And so this becomes, in its application, it becomes a little bit loose for a key governance document, in my opinion. The next page in 38 is my concern for you as council on this one is, and you may have had this discussion, I didn't find anything in the OCP, no matter how much was dedicated to it, I didn't see any clear articulation to you and the community on the risks that come with this. The first one is fire smart. So I'm not sure if your fire chief has looked through this. When I do a project and I know I want to preserve trees, the first person I take, other than my biologist out there and the president to make sure he's okay with me reducing the density because I want to save these trees, is the fire chief. Because the minute Fire Smart guidelines, as you all probably know now, ask that there's a 10-meter setback from any sticks, any trees, from every house. so that when the fire comes roaring through, up in the crown, comes crowning through because some kids had a smoke when they shouldn't have, comes ripping through, there's at least enough room there that it's not dropping burning embers all over the house and around the house. So 10 meters, they will allow some inside, but typically then you have to manage all of the needles and all the biomass that falls from a tree to make sure you prune it up quite a ways, so there's the least chance of that house catching on fire. I'm not sure if your fire chief looked at this. Here's my concern. If you get an interface fire, which happens periodically, it's a natural occurrence and usually human-caused here, you've got a lot of people living around here, a lot of people out recreating, and pretty soon we're going to have a new bylaw that allows you to smoke other things than cigarettes out there. There's going to be little embers. You get a long drought. Every summer is a drought here. If they take, then, and you have a house anywhere near there, and that thing catches on fire because the trees were very close, I can't imagine that not leading to litigation. So you may be able to avoid this. You may have already covered this off. I didn't find anything in this, but I encourage you, and the SAP, the Site Adaptive Planning, was an in-camera approval, so I couldn't get information about it. I encourage you to talk to your fire chief about that. Likewise, if the trees are kept and they blow down in a big climate change-caused storm or something, again, the distance, some of the other stuff, I don't know how exposed you would be there, but when you wade into this level of tree control, you take the commensurate liability, and I have some concerns that you need to make sure that you're comfortable with that liability. So some questions you might want to consider if you want to refine this. There are lots of other urban ecology systems and frameworks, and I'm about to give you one, a very simple one that I think you might want to consider. Look at some of the risks. Look at the older trees and how they're going to be managed, both in, because you kind of want to save them when you're doing site adaptive planning. Figure out, can you get some professional standards that would even this across, that would make this really crisp. And then there's going to be some implications that probably the community needs to be talked to about this. I'm going to move forward through the alternative on page 41. I encourage you to adopt a commitment to an urban ecosystem as opposed to the preservation of trees as the core basis. Sit down with some of you. You've got some fantastic people who've worked with you. I have the highest respect for Corey and Patrick at Aquatex. I think you know them very, very well. They're like probably some of the most respected aquatic and terrestrial creative biologists in the province. Work with them, work with anybody on an interesting kind of a new map, not just about preserving. You got to preserve your current creeks and some of your patches, but there's a whole new story that can be put in through development in the landscaping designs that would basically bring a whole new dynamic to the urban ecosystem, which would be very, very exciting. I'd encourage you to do some of that kind of work with this stuff. And then on a site-by-site basis, you can do a little bit of adjustments. The next two slides are my proposal to you based on my current projects. I'm pulling my landscape architecture education in with biologists, and we're doing this kind of work on a big project in the Okanagan, looking at keystone species of the kinds of species that thrive in urban environments. We know we need pollinators. I have a proposal for a thesis and a student right now on my desk, pushing the pollination. We're losing our pollinators. There's so many things in an urban setting and agricultural settings that damage them. We have to put a big push to bring them back in. Songbirds, everybody loves songbirds. They happen to be fantastic keystone species. Bats and amphibians or reptiles. By this I mean you don't usually see them. They're hanging out close to the creeks. They're in special little areas, or garter snakes. Then we look at Colwood and any other area, and we've got parks and plazas and streets and buildings and rooftops. We take the habitat of those species and our kind of urban environments, and we put them together into a new set of design guidelines. And that allows you to optimize the human performance and then actually put a really rich ecosystem back into that process. My concern with what I saw in the SAP was I didn't see this kind of urban ecology framework. If you've already had that discussion and it's already being implemented, then I apologize because I haven't seen that, but that's my recommendation. The next page is just a thought about the actual reality of using tree coverage and tree roots to define the spaces in your community. I would encourage you to take a look in your OCP map at the different kinds of uses. Some of them have intense community use. You really need that to be shopping and transit and high-density residential. Other areas are much lower and have much more natural priorities. So I just picked 4 and make a suggestion as follows. Each of them has a different existing foliage retention threshold. So if you're going in to put in a shopping center, it's 0 to 10%. If there's obviously an area that you can make work, great. Otherwise, it's okay if you don't, but you need to put a new ecosystem back. Now, in an office building in a shopping center, you're not going to be able to have huge green areas most of the time. So you're going to end up with a certain percentage that after a few years you can take a look at it, and it's calculated. Your landscape architect will sign off on that it'll have the foliage there. And you work your way through to increasingly rural areas. When you get to something that's a very large lot, fully treed environment now, which you might actually ask to preserve almost half of it. Like, just don't touch it. That's a really key environment. And so take out part of it, put your house, your garage, your pool, and your parking lot in, because it's a big lot, and then we need you to reforest it again. So if you look at that, you could, like my proposal here, you might end up with almost 80% tree canopy again by the end. Probably not a lot of food growing going on there, but somewhere in the range can be negotiated. That would allow you, with an urban ecosystem strategy, to end up becoming, without question, one of the municipal leaders in urban ecosystems around. There's been some talk around this. This is a huge opportunity for leadership for you. Moving on, the next one, structure of growth. We're in our last batch here. Structure of growth and community performance. Now we're getting down to the meat and potatoes of a typical OCP. Your OCP determines land availability, and I'm going to take a position. I don't think your director of planning completely agrees with me on this. We had a discussion in his office about it, but I'm going to take this position with you on this. I believe, after many years of working on the environmental leg of sustainability, that we've covered off a lot of that. That's really great. Now what we need to do, actually, in so doing, partly and through other things, we've accidentally created a massive housing crisis. So the cost of housing, I know you're all struggling with this. Every community is struggling with it. It is the new sustainability. If we can't bring the cost of housing under control, then we will basically destroy our communities. I left Vancouver. Everybody I know is leaving Vancouver. We're catching it here. The Okanagan right now is just a wash in money as everybody leaves, and it's driving prices up. And I'm like, whoa. So we're working with them on their OCP now, going, we need a lot more land. And it's the same conversation we're having here, because housing costs determine everything. They cost the services you can provide, the service workers who are there, whether you can age in place, right down to homelessness. So this is a really critical issue, and once the prices go up, they don't come down very easily. Now, I need to make an observation here. The people who put together bits of money from about 50 to 70 different entities that put together a bit of money to pay for the last month of my life on this, I am speaking against their interest, and I made that very clear to them when I had a workshop with them last week. This is not in your interest, but I'm going to say it because as a registered planner, talking about an OCP, I have to say this. If you already own land, why it's not in their interest is if you already own land, you want land values to go nuts. It is free money. You are doubling, tripling your profit margins. The project I helped bring to market in Lantzville this last year, in 18 months, the value of each lot went up $150,000, and we could have made it work in the original price. That is just pure cream. That is just a wash in cash. It's fabulous if you own land. If you don't own land, you're basically locked out. It becomes a price drawbridge. You can't even attract anybody into the Vancouver area now, which companies are basically now going to have to start basically migrating out of it because they can't attract staff. Tofino, Whistler, these towns that once the housing prices get up too high, you have perfectly good restaurants closing because they can't even find anybody to staff. First question in Whistler, if you want to get a job, do you have a place to stay? They won't even look at your CV until that. That's the trajectory we're on, and we do not want to follow Vancouver on that. We have to take a stand on this to pull it back. So why is housing so expensive? If you move to the next slides, basically it costs the same. I was going to insert something that just came out of the Western Real Estate Investor magazine. It showed the price of building a commercial building in 12 Canadian cities. Vancouver and Winnipeg, all of them are within 5% of each other. It costs exactly the same to build a building in Vancouver, a commercial building, as it does in Winnipeg. It was $95 a square foot for that particular one, between $95 and $105. The difference is the cost of land. So it costs pretty much the same for all of us to build buildings anywhere here. So when prices start to go crazy, it's because of land. Like any commodity, the price of land is set in the very bizarre and complex dynamic of supply and demand. At one level, it's a simple Adam Smith equation. In reality, there's a lot of stuff playing into that one. Interest rates, lots of other things, demographics. But builders have to buy land. That's how they make their living. Landowners don't have to sell their land. So we end up in an economic concept called price inelasticity. It doesn't matter if you raise the price, people still have to buy land. And they won't leave, they won't not buy land unless they can buy land somewhere else, cheaper, or for some other reason. So when you have these big price rises that start going up, it just keeps driving things up. What happens then, and I know this because this is driving my project right now in Kelowna, is that a whole new species of money arrives. I call it a species. There's two versions of it. The first one is, A huge amount of capital pours in because land no longer becomes land. Land is now an investment commodity. And so what happens then is they're looking to move in and out as fast as they possibly can. And it is a really bizarre experience to work on a project like that. The worst part is that a second species arrives which just wants to flip. This is what drove Vancouver crazy, was folks just coming in, they buy the pre-sale, put $10,000 down, they assign the deal literally 6 weeks later, and they make 10 grand on it. That's a 100% return in 6 weeks. That's a new species of money. It doesn't have anything to do with housing. Once housing prices start going up for more than just the usual every year now, demand goes up and it takes a while for us to get some more product on the market for them. Once it goes up on a regular basis, these new species of money come in and it wrecks your community. So that's, as a city planner looking at this, living in the development trenches, I just am constantly really in a state of frustration around what we're doing to our communities, even though we're making a lot of money doing it. The issue is that the municipality controls the supply of land, and the number one document you have in your regulatory toolkit to cover the supply of land is your OCP. So that's why this becomes a critical issue for this one. So if we want to move forward to the next couple pages, 48 and 49, this is an area where the planning field, and on behalf of all of my registered planners, I apologize to you. We have done a really bad job of understanding that ratio of how much demand, how much supply you need to keep your housing in a balanced market. And so I went to the realtors in the last few months and I started looking through all the VIREB history and all the different patterns. And the pattern I discovered from talking to them and looking at the statistics and mapping them out is that you typically need about a 15 to 20% ratio between the number of homes that are sold in any given time unit, a month, say, and the number of homes that are on the market. So think about that. It makes sense when you think about it for yourself. You want to go buy a home. If there's 5 choices out there that you and your partner or you and your family would go, yep, I could probably live with something like that, you're probably going to, if you want the house, you'll be paying close to asking price for that house, but you're not going to really go up or down. If there's 9 or 10 homes for the one you want, you're going to lowball them. So you're going to be a buyer's market then. So then the prices start to come down because you're undermining those prices and they start to come down. If you get out there and there's only 3 homes total and you need to get one of them, there's probably 10, 20 other people who want the same ones. Up goes the price in bidding wars, and that's what we've been living through in this process. And it all comes down to the supply of homes versus the demand. Now, when you go to an OCP, what you're going to be looking at is not so much the market demand, you're looking at the flux of people you know or that your share of the growth is. And in this case, it's 2,500 units over the next 10 years. It's 250 units a year. And so the question to ask of your OCP now is, how are we going to absorb that? Where are we going to absorb that? So I have 2 other key points here now to make that discussion on. The myth of gentle infill. This is a big fad in our profession right now, in the planning side of it, is, well, we'll take a single-family home and we'll take it down, we'll add a suite, we'll add a carriage house, or we'll take it down and we'll put a triplex in there instead. And your policies, these are good policies to have. I'm critiquing them not because they're bad policies, but because they don't absorb very much growth. So what you see on page 49 there is a very quick assessment. This took me just a couple of minutes with a calculator to figure this out. Your policies are to a triplex. I'm going to go to a fourplex. So a single-family home, I said $500,000. I'm not sure if you can go buy a single-family home with a suite in it for $500,000 in Colwood now. It's probably closer to 6, but let's say 5. That's $125,000 in land for each of the fourplex. Then you have new building costs. After you've put the building, you've paid all of the soft costs, all the consultants, all of the builders, you've paid for the new home warranty, you've paid for the all the studies, all of the municipal fees, all the interest you're going to pay on a $2 million loan, et cetera. It works out to about $300 a square foot. Now, it can be argued up or down. Those are the numbers we're using in a number of jurisdictions right now. 1,500 square foot home, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath. That means you're into $450,000 to build that piece of the building. No bank will give you the financing without a 15% profit margin, so there's another 75. So when we run that through land costs, building costs, and profit, you're at $650,000 for 1,500 square feet. No outdoor space. This is a fourplex. It basically fills the whole site because you've got a 6,000 square foot building plus a garage. So there's very, very little open space. It's urban living in that environment. $100,000 down, that's a $550,000 mortgage. That's $2,700 a month in payments. That's going to work out to well over $30,000 a year in payments you're going to be paying for this stuff, which requires a very high level of income for a bank to finance that. And so this is where the drama emerges, is that very quickly while gentle infill works, if you look on the next column, then we've actually only absorbed 3 people a year at this rate. Now, this was a nasty public hearing. Unless you pre-zoned that site, taking down a single-family home somewhere just off Machosen Road or out here on Wishart and putting in a fourplex, you're going to hear about it. So that might add a little bit more time. You might have to reduce the density. That just makes it more and more expensive. So great policy. Please keep it in. Absolutely necessary. But it's not going to absorb a lot of growth, which then takes us to the next discussions, which is the amount. I'll talk about climate first, and then I'll talk about the large projects. You have climate targets in here, 93% reduction in per capita emissions for everything by 2050, so you have 30 years. So your emissions come from 2 sources, as most communities do. 93% reduction means you're going to take your transportation emissions and cut them by 93%, your housing, your building emissions, and cut them by 93%. So what this means is 0 emission cars for everybody in Colwood over the next few years, 20-year cycle to get rid of rolling stock, to turn it over. So in the next 2 or 3 cars, everyone needs to shift to an electric car powered by renewable energy. You still won't get it all down because you've got lots of other stuff on the road. And so you need to shift to transit and walking. Now, what this means is you need very high densities along major transit corridors to get the transit cycling at a time when people will actually use it. For the buildings, all new buildings need to be 0 emission buildings. So this is Passive House. This is a net 0 building, starting pretty much immediately, because if you don't do it immediately, then you have to retrofit it before you get to 2050. You have roughly 6,900 to 7,000 buildings in Colwood right now, 6,900 homes, according to your OCP. That's 200 homes a year for a full net 0 retrofit. That is 1 per day, starting now for the next 30 years. Every business day, 5 days a week, you need to take an existing home in Colwood and tear it down to the bones, put on 6 inches of insulation, 3 to 6 inches of insulation, triple glazed windows, R50 in the ceiling, HRV, full new ventilation system, possibly a new roof system that has solar on it. You're all already onto that one. You're digging down into the foundations to insulate them. It's a $100,000 minimum retrofit, and it's going to trigger every building code update in every home. That's what it's going to be required to meet a 93% reduction in your emissions on that process. Now, that's pretty heavy. And so that's when I go back to what I was saying at the beginning. We put a target in, and then we just need to have a quick analysis of what does that look like. It gets worse. I'm sorry, it gets worse. Page 52 talks about the density issue. So now we're back into the OCP. You have a density target in your OCP of 45 people per hectare. At 2.5 people per unit, that's 7 units per acre. That's a 5,000 to 6,000 square foot lot. That's fairly large. I'm not sure that's going to support very much transit density right now. Your infrastructure target for efficiency is 6 to 7 meters per resident. Now, it didn't say what that actually all included, so I'm going to read that as the street in front of somebody's house. I don't know that it includes the length of water lines coming from your reservoirs or going to your district sewage treatment systems, but let's call it the level of the street. If you have 2.5 people in a single-family home on either side, that's a 30-meter frontage. That's 4 units per acre. That's quarter-acre lots. So these are very, very large. With respect to your climate targets, the City of Vancouver, I did their climate change plan when I was head of the sustainability office there. They've achieved a 15% reduction in the last 10 years. So this is the greenest city in the world by their standards. I was on the greenest city task force, and they scared me in what they were doing. They're at net 500 people per hectare, or 100 units per acre. They are 10 times your target, and they're starting to get that per capita decreased. It's going to get them, I don't think they'll reach your target, but they're going to get close. They have major green transit. They run electric buses on green electricity, walkable density. They put millions into bike lanes. That's the kind of look this happens. So when a target like that arrives, then the question is, wow, that's a really serious implication. We need to, this is some of the numbers and statistics that we need to take this back out to the community and go, are we on for that? Like, how does people feel about that kind of change? It doesn't necessarily have to be 10 times the density, but certainly where the transit is, it's going to need to be. Which brings the question to the geometry of growth, because you don't want to just sprawl everywhere. So our planning profession has kept everybody talking about town centers. They don't really work very well in reality because there's not enough land to develop in them. They look good on a map. What we need is corridors. And I think your community discussions have already started to do that, pulling the town centers from 400 meters back in the single-family zones back onto the main corridors. So what this does is it brings on a lot more land all of that land along those major corridors, I'm talking Latoria, Veterans Memorial, Machosen, et cetera, all really supports transit. So you then begin to get a chance at achieving those particular targets. So on the next page, 54, I would say that you might want to rethink this in the detail depending on what council's decision is on your targets, because your targets are then going to spin out into a whole lot of other areas. Page 55 is a concern I have. Right now you have the benefit and luxury of having a number of very large projects, Royal Bay, Colwood Corners, Olympic View, et cetera, that are bringing on hundreds, even thousands of units. So this next 10 years, it looks like you have quite a bit of housing to come along to meet the demand. In reality, the problem is Colwood Corners. So Colwood Corners, I remember being here 12 years ago in conversations, or 11 years ago. Colwood Corners was full under planning. There was big debates going on about that, and we see how far it went. Now, we can say why. The problem is, from a development point of view, big projects are extremely risky. You're bringing on huge amounts of units, huge amounts of costs, and if they can't get the cash flow in time, they almost always go bankrupt. And so you have a bit of a risk in that so much of your density in the future is sitting literally on the tables of the boardrooms of a very few companies, almost none of whom have deep roots here in Colwood. Olympic View maybe is a bit different, but many of them don't. They've been recently sold and moved around. The people care, the people who are working on them care, but from an OCP point of view, and again, I am not speaking in the interest of the people who put money forward to this. I'm kind of almost challenging this right now as in a professional space, that you need to diversify. You need the big people and the little people all working there, and that changes the growth absorption pattern. Open space, just here as I finish off this section, open space, you have a question there. I didn't understand the 40% public open space issue. I didn't see a threshold. You may have that already worked out. I didn't find it. From a development point of view, that's really freaky to find out that at some point someone may decide that they're going to take 40% of your land for public space unless there's clear big density transfers for it. So growth management policy then on 57, you need to check on this OCP whether you have enough land available, whether it's going to give you the density and transit walkability, whether those projects you're counting on, a quick pro forma analysis, just, it won't be right, but it'll give you kind of a sense of, do we think they'll actually work, clear up some of that open space rule. And then these are hard questions. I don't need to tell you that as a counselor, you would want to know what the community thought about this before you voted this one in. So let's just jump through the next couple of pages because we're moving here on time and energy. Let's jump to page 60. Unnecessary costs in development. We're just going to go down the rabbit hole here. Just go with me briefly on some of the design guidelines. I'm going to encourage you to pull back on the level of detail in this OCP, pull out key dimensions and things because it trips up over other bylaws and it sometimes can actually add unnecessary costs. So some of the DP guidelines are very general. I mentioned the ones of needs of teens. Other ones are right down to fence heights. I think you need to find a nice middle ground in that one, and we can move on. There's to page 62. There's some unnecessary controls. Every designer and planner designer loves to write the design guidelines and draw the pictures of what they want your community to be like, and they're almost always lovely, except you end up with a lot of preferences. So there's a guideline here that's only 40 meters wide for a building in your commercial areas. And it's like, well, I'm not quite sure why it's 40 and not 36.8 or 41.7. It can probably be flexibility. If there's a good working relationship with your staff, they can kind of work that out, but that's pretty intense, and each site needs a slightly different variation. We're not actually so concerned with the size as we are concerned about the granularity and experience. Ratios of open space to building height, there's a bunch of guidelines in there. Those came out of the early neo-traditional days of new urbanist planning. You'll find them in Peter Katz's books and DPZ's books when they went back to Britain and Europe and went, what's a nice space? Problem is that ratio starts to, it's a tail that wags a bunch of dogs, and it's unnecessary. Sign controls, door size, porch size, you don't need to control these in your OCP. I have one key issue just to note again in this case, the duplexes. Back to the side setbacks. There's a requirement here, or preference, that duplexes be side by side. Now, I've lived in a back-to-back duplex. It's actually fabulous. You feel like you're living in a single-family home. The streetscape looks single-family. They're nice, narrow homes. You never even see your neighbor because they're coming and going out of the back. It's fabulous. For some reason, the author of this at some point doesn't like those and prefers them side by side. So you end up with this very big wall of a house with two doors on it. The setbacks are then 4 meters on either side. The setback on a single-family home is 1.5. And so when you actually start adding that up, you end up with a duplex is actually less land efficient than two single-family homes because you've got a total of 8 meters of setback rather than 6 meters of setback, and I can sell single-family homes for more. And so what is actually, I'm sure there's some noble intent behind it, but I couldn't deduce that from the work, and that's just one example. There's a number of these things that are filtered through, so I don't want to make a big deal of that. There's other ones around parking. It asks for incremental pavers, and then asks you to paint lines on it, and then asks for 2 colors of them. They're in slightly different sections, but they almost all sound the same and look the same. And then there's also guidelines in here that directly challenge your engineering codes. So you're going to get people designing, going through some of the permitting process, and then they're going to run into engineering codes around VUNERFs, around extra narrow roads, things like that. So there's a bit of a refinement that needs to happen. Page 64 on hillsides. I know this is a big issue for you because you're now working up your hillsides. I was struggling to see there were a lot of policies on saving views, saving trees, and solar access that were bumping into each other, and I couldn't quite tell the difference between them. There's a guideline in there that asks that the houses be 1.2 meters above the road on a hillside, but it doesn't say just the uphill side. It just is a general guideline. I'm not sure. At 1.2, it's pretty specific. I pushed my wife around in a wheelchair for much of the last couple of years as she's gone through some very intensive ortho surgeries. That's a 50-foot ramp to get up 1.2 meters. It's a big, so the accessibility in an aging population with these kind of guidelines, I think we need to get a little more detailed in some of those cul-de-sacs, et cetera. Moving on then, so you can see there's a number of implications. I'll let you read those at another point, substantive and political. They're just my observations on it. I would encourage you to go through this, and my recommendation would be to go through it for free with some of the stakeholders who make their living doing this and try and really grapple with what do we mean here and can we clean this up so it works a little bit better. Moving on then to the last one on page 68, which I'm going to return to the difficult conversation at the beginning. I think we need to change some of the branding of the women and the men who build homes. They're not evil, cash, greedy, hungry developers coming to destroy your community. Actually, the only people who are going to build the housing and the businesses that you need. And you got a lot of feedback from them. They did participate in it, and they've invested a bunch of money in my time. This was supposed to be a small project, and it's ballooned into something huge. So there are bad developers. Let's just acknowledge that. They come in, they don't care much about your community. They'll do whatever they can to make a buck and leave. In my experience, they're a tiny fraction of the group. The majority of the folks, this is a pretty tough industry to be in. You don't make as much money as people think you make. A lot of people go bankrupt on a regular basis. Everything you own is at stake all the time, and you're just fighting fires all day. And so it's a real calling. It's a real desire to build something that's beautiful, that's great, that's part of the town. And any of them who've lived here have roots deep in this community, and they really do want to build it. We may or may not agree with any one of their aesthetics at any given moment, but that's kind of what these design guidelines are for. So I encourage you, moving on then to page 70, that you don't, because of their reality, they're very concrete people, they're extremely busy people, they're just running a 3-ring circus all day, as many of you are as well. We need to go and meet them where they are to talk about these issues in a respectful way and talk about them on the timeline that they can work with them on, because in the end, it's going to be the playbook by which they make their living, here or not. And so I think we need the luncheon in November with a 250-page document. I got invited to join in January. I've got a full plate of projects, so it took me quite a few weeks to get my head into this. We need some time. There's not going to be animosity there because you define the working environment for how they do business in Colwood. So there's a deep desire that I found of really wanting to be able to work together on it and really wanting that tone, that attitude to be matched from the city. I haven't lived here. I haven't done any projects. I have no personal experience. I'm merely passing on the struggles and frustrations that I heard. I would encourage you to rethink some of what happened in Olympic View in this last moment. Between the first and second draft, it would appear that an entire town center evaporated. Now, I'm not sure if you were all consulted on that and that was a council decision. I didn't see anything in the community notes that said get rid of the town center in Olympic View, but it disappeared between the first and second draft. The master plan is still there, but there's a demand or a request to revisit the whole thing. So there's a big concern. Now, that is on one of your Seward transit lines. So if there ever was a place, if you want to meet your climate goals or to get close, to really ramp up the density, is to go into some place like that and really do something like that one. Moving forward then, just so we can get to the end here. So as I end here, I'd just like to propose that you address this paradigm and you work with them, that you do some mutual education and enhancement of each other, what we're doing. The simplest way that I see that you can do this is to create a formal development advisory committee that works with you, that evaluates your policies. Folks will come in for free. Again, they're very busy, but they'll give you free advice. You don't have to hire a bunch of consultants to do that. And you can start building that relationship and working protocols with the review of this OCP. So I think you have a couple of choices just to move to the last couple of slides here. You can, if you absorb this as it is, if you approve it right now, all of these issues are going to stay with you for the next 10 years plus, and I think it's going to cause you unnecessary grief. If you get down to the details now of the due diligence on those and then go back and have a good discussion with yourselves, with stakeholders of different types, and then go back to the community with the hard choices there, I think actually this is going to be fairly easy to work out. It's just right now it's nowhere near ready for that one. And I'm just concerned that the community doesn't understand what's going on and things like that. So those, I believe, are your final choices, and I'd just like to leave you with what I think would be a fantastic vision of some of the communities that I've had success in working with, is where the OCP and the planning bylaws, what you actually get to do is you get to harness all of the women and men in the development industry and all the financing they can bring to your town to actually build more of what the community wants rather than less when those visions are put together in the details, that there's a sense of trust and openness. You can sit down and talk with each other. You can go, I don't like that. What happened there? We need to fix that. I don't want that to happen again. I have a lot of concern, or council has a lot of concern. You can get to a really good open working relationship and educate each other, that there's clear facts that are being exchanged and the implications of things are well understood. What happens then is you reduce the conflict, you get the vision that you wanted, the working relationship grows, and you actually get to build the community. The public gets all of the positive results from that. So my final thing here to do then is just to hand out a proposed, we drafted a short motion. Very presumptuous of your chair. But we wanted to, and I need to reiterate, I am so grateful for the time. I did not know whether we were going to be able to take this time, and you've given us an enormous amount of time to have this discussion. It's difficult to do it in a public location under the lights, but I'm so grateful to you for having done that. It's a lot of courage, it's a lot of commitment to detail, to integrity, and to honesty and transparency in this process. You deserve to be congratulated for that. So there is a proposed statement, a motion that would suggest that you create some kind of a formal working structure and sit down and work with all of the women and men who build these buildings to work on this draft to get the problems out of it and make it so it's a really fantastic navigation map for the next 10 or 12 years. And I will stop there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Holland. That was a lot of information to try to digest, and I'm not sure that committee's in the position to necessarily make a motion tonight, but certainly needs a lot of time, and as do staff, to kind of digest the thoughts and the flavors of what you presented tonight. So before we come to committee, I will open it up to the public who may have a question or want some clarification from Mr. Holland based on his presentation. I do ask if you can come up to the microphone and ask Mr. Holland your question, and please state your name for the record. That's great.
I'm Chris Wright. I reside on Marion Crescent. Actually, my question's a real easy one because I already asked Mr. Holland's question, so I know the answer is yes. Is there a way for the city to put the slide notes that most of you have had, but few of us in the audience have seen? Could you put those on the city website somewhere, please, or attach them to the minutes for this meeting so that people can see what was discussed? Thank you.
Yeah, I understand that that's not an issue. Anyone else before we come to committee? I imagine a good whack of folks in the audience have probably seen the contents of this presentation already, so they're probably... No? That's surprised.
Sorry, it was just suggested, Michael Baxter, 333 Acewink Road, sorry. It was just suggested that either the slides be put on the website, pure and simple, or that they be attached to the minutes. If they're attached to the minutes, we won't see them for quite a while. So I hope they'll just be put on the website.
Yeah, I think there's a desire to put them on the website. Yeah. Anyone else?
Councillor Logan, public, thank you very much. Dave Saunders, 813 Pears Road. And I wasn't going to speak tonight, but I do need to clarify for everybody in the audience, because I think that there does need to be some sort of healing in this process, in that this group of 50 to 70 people, many that aren't in attendance, that won't even write a letter into the city to give input out of fear is wrong. That there's been words expressed at this council table that this group somehow wanted to do something behind closed doors is just simply incorrect. And I will be very honest, I was offended by those comments. What initiated this was a 214 process by our former director of planning that started the OCP process. I don't know where that planning process went off the rails, but then in 216, it reinvigorated itself through a simple staff report. And if you read the staff report, it talks about unusual circumstances. It talks about an unusual process. It talks about a different process. I can tell you that these developers have been instilled with a process for over 20 or 30 years. I've been former chair of planning and zoning. I don't know how many OCP processes I've been involved in so many different municipalities. For anybody to say that these developers that are significant stakeholders in our community haven't been part of the process is incorrect. I can tell you they watch this process more thoroughly than mayor and council, more thoroughly than the committee members. They may not appear at all the committee meetings. However, they are watching it. The luncheon that was held, where mayor and council were purposely not invited to, I wished you could have been there to see the shock of these developers. There was a staff member at our table that didn't even know that the site adaptive planning was already being instituted against development. That's one of your staff members that didn't know that. So from that process, and I want to be clear here, several people approached me. I didn't want to get dragged back into this. I've done my penance. I've been up there. I didn't want to be. I got dragged back into it because I believe in Colwood, as does everybody here. What I didn't believe in is that our development community had been thoroughly consulted. So I approached our mayor and council through email. I talked to our mayor, Carol Hamilton. She brought forward a good idea that we create somewhat of a liaison committee that we're able to address in a forum that is open and transparent. For whatever reason, that open and transparent process got instilled as we wanted to do something behind closed doors. Maybe that was a poor choice of words. Maybe everybody's frustrated. Let's get back to the basics. Everybody wants to build a great community. This is a huge document, more so than I've seen in any other municipality. But we have to work cooperatively together to flesh out what is wrong in this. And there is some stuff wrong in this. And get back to the basics. It's certainly not going to be done by rushing it through. I know everybody here. I know most of everybody in the audience. Let's all work together rather than work apart. It's not an us versus them, as what I've seen on your city webpage. When we first announced that we had this group that is made up of stakeholders, developers, and citizens, you need to take a leadership role right now to address a stigma that's been dogged in Colwood for a long, long time. This membership hired this professional independently. Most of the people in this audience that are members of that Colwood Stakeholders Community Group hadn't even seen those documents. So when Mark is saying it's independent, it purely is independent. I value the work that staff have done on all this process. The public involvement has been tremendous. But in the original documents that I have before me, it talks about a different stakeholder and different processes for different things that arise. From that November meeting, different things arose that needed to be addressed in a different fashion. And when you talk to developers or when you talk to different stakeholders, they are sometimes different than the public. And they'll sit back and they'll let the public bring forward a vision. And then they look at that vision through a draft form, and then they say, how can we compromise to make it work for both? You guys are all true leaders. We've got some great leaders in the audience. Let's lead, and let's work together. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Anyone else before we come to committee? Seeing none, committee? Jason?
First of all, I'll have to say that I agree wholeheartedly with the questions on our emission targets. I honestly don't believe we will ever meet those. You're not going to get that many people out of gas-driven automobiles by 2050. I mean, they used to predict that if the price of gas went to $1 a liter, everybody would quit driving. Well, it's pushing $1.50 in some places now, and I don't see any reduction in it. The retrofitting of 200 homes per year sets a pretty interesting goal to reach zero emissions. And again, I don't think that's going to happen. I think the residents are so strapped with meeting mortgage payments that to do that level of restoration on a house is an unreasonable expectation. So I think that's something we should definitely review. The city itself, we're doing a good job in reducing our emissions as city vehicles and so forth, but we can't regulate that on our residents or on the people that drive through Colwood. So that is a very important fact. I had one question for the author here. Page 48, you say we have to build 2,500 units in the next 10 years. I was just wondering what population figures you were basing that on, because if it's the CRD predictions, we've again and again pointed out how fraudulent those numbers are. It's just
Councillor Nault, I was just using the numbers in here for the projected growth that, and if I got something wrong on that one or misunderstood it, I apologize. It was in the regional context statement, I believe.
no, I think it's you're 100% right in what you quote, but those are based on the CRD
Okay.
population figures, and the committee itself has asked those to be reviewed
Very
because
good.
we are going to grow and we are going to double in size, but I don't think it's in the time that the CRD predicts.
Very good,
So-
and that gives you more room.
Yes.
It should release some of the pressure on housing prices.
Anyone else from committee? No? Rob?
Thank you. Mark, thank you very much. I think you posed more questions than answers there, which I think is going to be great to bring back to staff. I mean, I've taken a couple pages of notes that I would hope to get some answers on. One of the first things you started, though, was, and this is a pure estimate, and I'm not holding you to this or anything, but you mentioned, obviously, as we went through this, there's a significant amount of questions and answers that we need to find, and you mentioned, I can't remember where in this page, but you were talking about there's like 15 steps or so, and that we're basically halfway there, in your opinion. In your opinion, how much work, and what I'm talking about is time investment, are we away from actually being complete?
That would it's an excellent question, sir. That would entirely depend on the time. The way my recommendation to you was to establish a committee that has some substance, a formal committee of some sort, that taps the expertise of the people who will basically live with this. And then they're busy, you're busy. If you set in like a bi-weekly meeting process that you could get a core group and work your way through that, it's very difficult to predict how long that would work. I think you would actually make some fairly good progress. Tonight brought in some dark clouds and rained all over this. In reality, at 250 pages, I mean, it really needs to be kind of shrunk back a bit. It's a bit heavy going. I expect your staff feel the weight of that every day. I think a lot of it actually can be accomplished fairly quickly. You'll run into some points where there will be irreconcilable differences. That's come back to council. You make those decisions accordingly. So if you got in a regular meeting process with a good group of people and you could work, page chapter by chapter, section by section through this, doing the diligence, sitting down, having them. Some of the folks here, I said, guys, I don't develop here, so I don't know any of the numbers. They gave me pages and pages of numbers, right down to bullet points on that whole thing. I thought I could take you through that, but I don't. That's the thing of any value added in this context. So a really good working session with some council and staff to work your way through this all the way through. I don't know how long it'll take. It's going to take you X number of months to get through it. There's 25 sections in this, or more than 27 sections or something. It's quite a bit. A lot of them are fairly repetitive, so if you solve them on, chapter 23, probably a good deal of them got fixed on chapter 26. I really couldn't tell you exactly how long that's going to take. It's going to take you a few months to get through that, just because everybody's busy. If you can get a group that would meet weekly to work through it, it's kind of hard with families over the summer, so it's probably going to be a little more than that, but that would be my recommendation. Again, that's just my personal opinion from projects I've been involved in. Because what I'm concerned about when you hear that I think you're halfway through is that, oh my gosh, now that's a whole bunch of money. Now we have to go spend a bunch more money on consultants, both to run a project and all these experts. The expertise is here. They're the ones that you work with on a daily basis here. So you just need to work with them. They're the ones who are going to live with this. So they actually know this. They live it all day long. So that shouldn't cost you very much money so long as you can fit into how they can work with you on it. So it's a bit of an ambiguous answer, but I don't see it as, well, this is a heavy. Oh, and by the way, if you come and take my classes, we're halfway through the first class. My classes are 3 hours every time of this. The students groan. My student reviews are not pretty at the end of the year. This is heavy going, but actually when you get down into the document, you'll take whole sections. Some of my notes, I'd go, nice, excellent, good, done. Half a page, a full page. No, I don't have anything to say about that. Next page, like, oh, okay, whoa, we got to talk about this. So it'll be uneven how it goes through, but I think whatever X number of months would be to move through this. Can you get it done before the election? You got a summer in there, and things start getting pretty squirrely in the fall. That makes it a little difficult to do this kind of work, so you might want to get as much work as you can done and have the incoming council, which I expect will probably still have many or all of you on it. I don't know the politics of Colwood or how many of you are running, but let's say you all move forward. Then as having a new mandate for the next 4 years, you adopt the blueprint for the community for the next 10. There's an elegance to that. There's a real sense of sort of responsibility that comes with that. So if it slid just past the election, personally, but that's me. This is not you. So I think it's going to take you a few months to work through it because there's a lot of content here, but it may not be as bad as I've made it out to be.
Through the chair. So my next question is, I got the sense you talked about two specific things. One, that we were too general at times, that we were talking, for example, I wrote it down. Where did I write it down? Protect the environment, in that it's very ambiguous term. Mm-hmm. And then you also talked about that we became very, very specific on specific things. So I guess I'm trying to get a sense from you of your opinion of, is it like 50-50? Is the document more too general and not specific enough, or is it too specific and not general enough?
In the general terms, what I was talking about was more a specificity of language of when we say protect the environment. Let's just spend a few minutes thinking about what we meant by that, and we might actually say, well, really what we mean is this, or there's a couple of sentences. So it takes a bit of time to think about it. It's not so much being general or specific at that larger level. It's being clear about what it is we really meant. In the case of the detail, things like I just opened it to page 233 in the residential mixed-use guidelines. It says a setback from arterial roads should be 12 meters. I don't think your OCP needs to establish a setback of 12 meters. The point is, it actually says to allow for screening and berming. So we can talk about that setbacks and landscaping should achieve the following outcomes. And you can get a little more specificity in that if you really want to in a particular unique area. You don't have big heritage control areas here where you have to kind of work with those. So you sit down with someone who's going to have to do that and they go, well, we don't 12, 11, 13. Well, let's not set a distance there. Let's just clean that up a little bit. What are you trying to achieve here? How about we phrase it this way? And it's like, yeah, okay, well, then the city gets what it's trying to get. But there's enough flexibility in it. That's what I meant. We could have that conversation. You and I could sit down and have that conversation pretty quickly here. Low fence of 1.2 meters. Yeah, maybe. I don't know that we need to say what the fence height is. You probably have the fence heights are already covered in zoning bylaws most of the time. So you can probably even just take that out.
And then my final question I have is you definitely had some negative things to say about site adaptive planning. And I guess, one of the things that you brought up was about standards and that. And I guess I'm just looking for you to just expand on that just a little for me to understand why there's such a concern from your standpoint around site adaptiveness.
When you're doing development planning, so when we get started on building some homes in a place like Colwood, before you bought the land, you do what we'd call a yield study. So you're going to sit down, and what you do is you do a quick calculus. When I teach my students this, I say lay a 5-meter grid down on the site, just 5 meters. Pretty much everything you're going to do on a site is a derivative of 5 meters. A road right-of-way is 4 of them, 20-meter road right-of-way. A service lane is roughly 2 of them if you can get a service lane bylaw to support it. The minimum size of a home unit for a townhouse, row house, is 5 meters. You pretty much don't want them much narrower than 15 feet, or 16 feet. So you lay that kind of grid out. What we're looking for then is what's on the site that's taking land out of the availability. So here comes a riparian area through part of the land. It's like, okay, that swath is out. We might be able to get something, like some of the streets and roads might be able to get within 10 meters. It's non-fish bearing, let's say. But we're going to need to permit 30 meters back. This is a big permitting swath. So I basically draw that, and that took that land out. The issue around what trees can be saved or not saved, I can work with my biologist on that, because my biologist knows there's a whole stack of provincial legislation on what's allowed to happen in the corridor. Around the trees, there's no standards for what that is. We can draw a vegetation map, and then it's like, well, I don't know, when I go in to negotiate, I'm not sure, can we take these trees out or not? In what I propose as an alternative, we would say, well, in this case, we would be in a Class 3 land. We are going to need to keep 25% of the vegetation on site. Absolutely. Whether or not that's part of the RAR area, that's for part of that standard to be set. It's like, okay, so, and here are the principles of what we're trying to do. And a biologist would say, well, continuity is a principle, this is a principle. They're professionals and they understand, so this is how that would work. So we'll save those trees over in this area. Right now, I don't know what standards to hold myself against. So even before you buy land, and if it happens after you bought land, then you may have basically been rezoned, have whole swaths of your land taken out of play. That's what I was trying to get at. Did that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. And then the question of what you do save and what you don't save, and how you save it, and how close you are, and if it's on a slope, does it end up just killing the tree anyway because all the water runs away, or how to do that? We need some crisper standards to that.
Thank you. Mayor Hamilton?
Thanks, Mark, for your presentation and work on this. I think it's important that we, have everything aligned through this, and I just want to let you know that the land use bylaw is another one that's in the works of being reviewed, and along with some of the others. So there will be continuity and there will be consistency through the documents, or at least that's our target.
Excellent.
I was hoping for a bit more on the solution side of things, coming out of this, because I think it was clearly identified by the developer group of, some of those broad concerns. And so I'm anxious to get a better read on the materials that are here, and certainly consult with staff around what aligns and how this may work in tweaking some of those details, like you said, with maybe not enough and maybe too much some other places. So looking forward to continuing conversation, but wanted to thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Councillor Day.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. In your slides, you say that the OCP is actually written for home builders. And I have to challenge you a little bit on that, because it's the community as a whole, including the home builders, but we all have to live here. And it's a scary process for everyone in Colwood when we're reviewing our OCP. And I certainly don't want to shut anyone out or not take seriously the advice that you give in regards to maybe what we could do differently. In regards to no specific issue discussions, I think that is important, and I would hope that we can find some sort of a forum going forward. There are significant areas in the OCP that caused me to have some concern. So I can certainly respect that there is concerns from all the landowners in Colwood. But when we undertake a process, it's really important to me that is an open process and that all members of the community are invited to participate, because it is the community vision, and the community's vision has been ignored in the past. We've had, lots of community consultation where the wishes and concerns of members of the community were not taken into account. They were duly noted, written up in a report, and then the council of the day went in a different direction. So I think it is important, many of the details that you identified, including, staff discretion, qualified professionals, maybe not being, so I think those are a great place to start with a discussion of how can we make this work better. But I don't think that either can we throw everything out that we've heard from the community. And we have really heard from the community in terms of the importance of green spaces. And it's really obvious from Google Maps that where we've lost our green spaces is through development. It isn't, the developed area of Colwood where the trees are falling in the last 10 years. It is the areas that are for development. So we need to address that issue in a way that can be functional. We both want to be able to have new homes in Colwood, and we want to be able to also retain the green spaces that the community values. So I guess it just leaves me to wanting to, I can see that it's always hard to bring this process to a close. I'm sure staff must have felt the same way, that there's always more work to be done. So I do really appreciate many of the details that you've brought to our attention where things don't quite match up, or where statements are maybe a very specific statement and it should be in a broad area, or vice versa. And those are certainly things that we could, as a community, come together to look at. But I certainly would want us to be every bit as inclusive in that process as we have been up until this point.
Thank you. Anyone else? Seeing none, I do want to thank you, and I want to thank the group that commissioned your study. I think what it did is it provided a lot of really good input into the existing draft, and certainly there will never be 100% buy-in. So there's stuff that I agree with, some that I don't, and there has to be some recognition too that, and that's not what I initially picked up out of the presentation, but what I'm looking for is some recognition that plans, master plans that were developed 10, 15, 20 years ago and seen as acceptable need to adapt and change to what the current desires of the community are today, because they're different, from even 5 years ago. And so I hope there's a little bit of that recognition as well, that the communities change and their hopes and dreams change. Some are colored by what has transpired in other communities, not just our neighbors, but in other communities, and those that live here and will stay here, are thinking, not for me, So I do appreciate the opportunity, and I hope you saw that this meeting was a reflection of our desire as a municipality to hear what the development community needed to say and the input, and this meeting was a request of the development community. So I think the appropriate thing now is for staff to take this back and really digest what the contents are, and maybe measure them against what is in the draft OCP, and then come back with some comments for committee and council to digest and reflect on. Thank you. Okay, seeing none, there is one last opportunity for public participation, and then that will be it for tonight.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Judith Collington, 3338 Acemink. I think there was a very big ask made of you tonight, and I'm not part of that group, but if I was part of that group, my question would be, it goes back to staff, but when does it come back to council to make a decision? Is this going to come back to your next council meeting for a kind of where do we go next on the OCP? Because otherwise I would sort of, both as sort of somebody who's participated in most, if not all, of the steering committee meetings, but also kind of hearing some of the I think, excellent suggestions that came out tonight. My question is, I absolutely get that, a referral to staff is appropriate, but when does the decision then come forward is my question.
Okay. I will defer to staff. Did you have a question? Yep.
With us running committee of the whole and then following council meeting, that's just like next Monday, so I can't see it being reasonable that staff would have enough time between now and agenda day, which is Thursday, to flip something around. So it would not be, in likelihood, next meeting.
Mr. Borhill?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, the current stage of this process is we're at first reading stage of the bylaw. So staff are receiving comments from the larger community and entities that were formally referred the bylaw at first reading stage. So we're collecting that now, and the intention was to bring forward a staff report with some analysis and summary of the submissions we've received since first reading. Right now we're looking at that happening in potentially, we're looking at sort of mid-April. We wouldn't be bringing forth a response to this submission unless specifically on its own, unless council directed us to. So if that's council's desire, that should be thought of at the next council meeting.
Mr. Vincer.
Hi, John Vincer, 3340 Painter Road. Oh, I'm losing my paper here. So just a couple very quick comments. I'd like to thank Mr. Holland for his very detailed analysis of the OCP. But during the talk he had with all of us, he was talking about two sides of the coin again, and I'm kind of echoing what Councillor Day said. There are more than two sides of the coin, and the citizens are the other side of the coin. So I'd just like to point that out. And in the name of inclusiveness, I would urge not again for the group that put together this presentation to talk behind doors again with council or staff. In the name of inclusiveness, I think it should involve the other stakeholders, the citizens. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else have a comment or question before we wrap up for tonight? Seeing none, then we don't have a date for the next meeting, so I will ask for a motion to adjourn. All those in favor?